Everyone in that room believed the same thing, that she wouldn't fight back. It wasn't said out loud at first, it didn't need to be. It lived in the glances, in the relaxed posture of those seated at the table, in the faint smile that never left her daughter-in-law's face, a smile of certainty. Margaret Hale sat at the far end of the dining room table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her posture was straight, her expression calm, almost distant. If anyone had bothered to look closely, they might have noticed how still she was, too still, as if she had already learned that any movement, any reaction would be used against her. But no one was looking at her. They were looking at Evelyn. Evelyn Hale leaned back in her chair with the comfort of someone who believed the outcome was already decided. She crossed her legs slowly, deliberately, and rested one manicured hand against her chin. Her eyes flicked toward Margaret only once, just long enough to measure her. Still quiet, still obedient. Good. She won't fight back, Evelyn said softly, her voice smooth, almost amused. She didn't whisper it. She didn't need to. The confidence in her tone carried across the table. Richard, Margaret's son, avoided his mother's eyes. He stared at the legal documents spread in front of him, as if they might rearrange themselves into something easier to explain. His silence wasn't uncertainty. It was surrender. The attorney cleared his throat. "We're only here to make things orderly," he said, offering a rehearsed smile that failed to reach his eyes. "After your father's passing, it's important that assets are managed responsibly." Margaret nodded once. Orderly. That word had followed her for years. She had been orderly when her husband fell ill and the hospital bills piled up. Orderly when she sold her jewelry to cover expenses no one else would acknowledge. Orderly when she packed away her grief so her son could continue his career uninterrupted. Orderly meant invisible. "We just need you to sign," the attorney continued, sliding the folder slightly closer to her. "This will allow Richard and Evelyn to handle the estate moving forward." Evelyn's smile widened, just a fraction. Margaret looked down at the papers. They were dense, precise, filled with language designed to intimidate anyone who didn't speak it fluently. She understood more than they thought. She always had, but understanding had never protected her before. "Mom," Richard finally said, his voice strained, "this is for the best." For whom, he didn't say. Margaret raised her eyes slowly, meeting his gaze. He flinched, not visibly but enough. She saw guilt there, fear, and something else, relief, because if she signed, the burden would be gone, and if she didn't, she would become the problem. Evelyn leaned forward now, resting her elbows lightly on the table. Her tone softened, but her eyes hardened. "You don't need to worry about anything anymore," she said. "We'll take care of everything." The words sounded generous. They were not. Margaret had heard them before, in different forms, different rooms, always with the same outcome. "You don't need to worry. You don't need to decide. You don't need to speak. Just trust us." She studied Evelyn carefully. The woman was younger, sharper, dressed in quiet luxury that spoke of control rather than taste. She had learned quickly how to occupy space without asking permission. Margaret wondered, not for the first time, when exactly she had stopped occupying space at all. "Take your time," the attorney said, tapping the pen gently against the table. "But this really should be settled today." Today. There was always a deadline when consent was expected. Margaret reached for the pen. Evelyn's smile never faltered. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The quiet widow, the tired mother, the woman who wouldn't resist, because women like Margaret never did. Margaret held the pen between her fingers but didn't sign. Not yet. Her hand rested on the paper, steady. Too steady. The attorney shifted in his seat. "Is there a problem?" he asked. Margaret lifted her gaze, her eyes calm, unreadable. "No," she said softly. "I was just remembering something." Evelyn's smile tightened just slightly. "Remembering what?" Margaret looked down again, scanning the page, clause after clause. Transfer of authority, release of claims, waiver of future disputes. They had been thorough, careful, confident. They hadn't expected her to read. They hadn't expected her to remember. She closed the folder gently. "I won't sign today," Margaret said. The silence that followed was immediate and sharp. Richard looked up, startled. "Mom," Evelyn laughed lightly, waving a dismissive hand. "She's overwhelmed, that's all." Margaret didn't respond. The attorney forced a polite smile. "Mrs. Hale, delaying this only complicates things. Then perhaps, Margaret replied, her voice even. It deserves to be complicated. Evelyn leaned back again, crossing her arms now. This was new, not dangerous, not yet, just inconvenient. She won't fight back, Evelyn said again, but this time the smile didn't reach her eyes. She never does. Margaret met her gaze, and for the first time she smiled too. Not warmly, not kindly, but knowingly. Because Evelyn was right about one thing. Margaret hadn't fought back before, but she hadn't been preparing before either, and they had no idea what she had already put in motion. They thought her refusal was temporary, a moment of confusion, a delay caused by grief, something that could be corrected with pressure, patience, or time. They were wrong. What Margaret Hale did next didn't look like resistance. It looked like compliance with a slower rhythm. She didn't argue, she didn't accuse, she didn't raise her voice or demand explanations. She simply stood up from the table, thanked the attorney for his time, and said she would call when she was ready. Evelyn watched her closely as she left the room, her smile frozen in place. It wasn't anger she felt. Not yet. It was irritation, the kind that comes when a process doesn't unfold as planned. "She'll come around," Evelyn said once Margaret was gone. "They always do." Richard nodded, though uneasily. He wanted to believe that, needed to. But that night, when Margaret returned to the house she had lived in for over 40 years, she didn't cry. She didn't pace. She didn't call anyone to complain. She sat at her kitchen table and opened a drawer that hadn't been touched in years. Inside were folders, old ones, labeled in her handwriting, not sentimental keepsakes, not memories, records. Her late husband, Thomas Hale, had been meticulous, not because he was controlling, but because he trusted systems more than people. During the last years of his life, when illness had weakened his body and sharpened his instincts, he had begun documenting everything, every transfer, every account, every change made under pressure, and Margaret had watched him do it, quietly, when doctors spoke only to Richard, when Evelyn began helping with finances. When signatures appeared on forms, Thomas barely remembered signing. Margaret had been there, invisible as always, but not unaware. She opened the first folder and flipped through the documents slowly. Her movements were unhurried, deliberate. Each page confirmed what she already knew. They hadn't just underestimated her, they had underestimated how much she had seen. The next morning, Evelyn called. "Margaret," she said sweetly, "I just wanted to check in. Yesterday must have been overwhelming." Margaret listened calmly. "Yes," she said. "It was." "Well," Evelyn continued, "we don't want things to get complicated. Richard is under a lot of stress." Margaret almost smiled. "Of course," she replied. "So was Thomas." There was a pause on the line. "What do you mean?" "Nothing," Margaret said gently. "Just remembering." Evelyn didn't like that word. Remembering implied history. History implied evidence. "We should reschedule the signing," Evelyn said, her tone firmer now. "The attorney is available tomorrow." "That won't be necessary," Margaret replied. "I've scheduled my own appointment." "With whom?" Evelyn asked quickly. Margaret hesitated just long enough to be intentional. "A specialist," she said. The call ended shortly after. Evelyn sat very still, phone in hand. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Margaret's appointment wasn't with a lawyer at first. It was with a records office. Then a bank branch. One that Evelyn had never visited because it predated her involvement. One that still recognized Margaret Hale not as an inconvenience, but as an account holder. Then an old colleague of Thomas's. And finally, an attorney. Not the family's attorney. Her own. He listened without interrupting as Margaret laid out the story, not emotionally, not dramatically, but chronologically. Facts were harder to dismiss. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "They assumed you wouldn't contest this," he said. "Yes," Margaret replied, "they still do. That may be their mistake." Margaret nodded once. She had learned something important over the years. Silence wasn't weakness. It was storage. Meanwhile, Evelyn's confidence began to crack, not visibly but internally. She started making calls of her own, checking balances, asking questions she hadn't needed to ask before. Some answers didn't come as quickly as they used to. One account required additional verification. Another had restrictions she didn't remember authorizing. When she asked the family attorney about it, he frowned. "That's unusual," he said. Evelyn forced a laugh. She probably misunderstood something. The attorney didn't laugh back. Richard noticed the shift first. The way Evelyn snapped at small things. The way she double-checked documents that had already been reviewed. "Is everything okay?" he asked one night. "Yes," she said quickly. Why wouldn't it be? Because for the first time she was unsure. Margaret, on the other hand, moved through her days calmly. She gardened, she cooked, she attended church. No one suspected a thing. That was the brilliance of it. Resistance that announces itself invites opposition. Preparation invites oversight. One afternoon, Margaret received a message from the attorney. "They've requested another meeting," he said. "They seem eager." Margaret smiled faintly. "Then it's time," she said. The meeting took place in a different room this time. Not the dining table. A conference room. Neutral. Professional. Controlled. Evelyn arrived first, dressed sharply, carrying confidence like armor. Richard followed, quieter than usual. Margaret entered last. She looked the same as she always had. That was the problem. "She won't fight back," Evelyn told herself again. The attorney began reviewing the documents. "Before we proceed," Margaret said calmly, "I'd like to add something to the record." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "This isn't necessary," she said. "It is," Margaret replied. She slid a folder across the table. Not aggressively, not dramatically, just far enough. The attorney opened it and stopped. The room changed. Richard leaned forward. "What is that?" he asked. Margaret folded her hands. "That," she said softly, "is everything you didn't ask me about." Evelyn's smile disappeared, because for the first time she understood. Margaret hadn't been delaying, she had been assembling, and the woman they believed wouldn't fight back had already chosen her battlefield. The moment the folder touched the table, the room stopped breathing. It wasn't dramatic. There was no raised voice, no accusation. Margaret didn't need any of that. The weight came from what the documents represented: time, patience, and a truth that had been quietly preserved while everyone else rushed to control the narrative. The attorney flipped the first page, then the second. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. She tried to look bored, disinterested, as if this was all a waste of time. But her eyes betrayed her. "What exactly is this supposed to prove?" she asked, her voice sharper than before. Margaret didn't answer. She didn't need to. The attorney cleared his throat. "These records show multiple amendments made to financial arrangements during Mr. Hale's final year. Amendments that do not match the documentation we were provided earlier." Richard frowned. "That doesn't make sense. Everything was handled legally." "Yes," the attorney replied carefully. "That's precisely why this is concerning." Evelyn sat forward. "You're saying my husband did something wrong?" The attorney hesitated. He had learned long ago that accusations were dangerous when facts were still unfolding. "I'm saying," he said, "that the timeline doesn't align." Margaret watched Evelyn closely now, not with anger, with attention. The same attention she had given her for years, observing patterns, noting reactions. This was the first crack. Evelyn smiled, but it was brittle. "Margaret, dear, I think grief is confusing you. Thomas trusted us. He wouldn't hide things from his own son." Margaret tilted her head slightly. "Thomas trusted facts," she said, "not assumptions." Richard looked between them, uneasy. "Mom, what are you implying?" Margaret met her son's eyes. "I'm not implying anything," she replied. "I'm presenting records." The attorney closed the folder gently. "I'll need time to review these thoroughly." Evelyn stood abruptly. "This meeting is over." Margaret didn't move. "With respect," the attorney said, "it isn't." That sentence hit harder than any accusation. Evelyn froze. Authority had shifted, subtly but unmistakably. She gathered her purse with controlled movements, her expression cold. "We'll continue this another time," she said, "when everyone has had time to think clearly." Margaret nodded. "Of course." As they left the room, Evelyn's phone buzzed. A message from the bank. Account access temporarily restricted pending verification. Her breath caught. She didn't show it. But that night she didn't sleep. For the first time since Thomas's death, Evelyn felt something she wasn't accustomed to feeling. Vulnerability. The following days were a blur of calls and unanswered questions. The family attorney stopped returning messages promptly. The bank requested additional documentation. A notary appointment was postponed indefinitely. Every system Evelyn thought she controlled suddenly required oversight. She blamed Margaret. "She's manipulating things," Evelyn told Richard. "She's always played the victim." Richard rubbed his temples. "But what if there's something we missed?" Evelyn snapped. "There is nothing to miss. She doesn't understand these things." That was the belief holding everything together, and it was starting to fail. Margaret, meanwhile, continued her routine. Church on Sunday, groceries on Monday, a quiet lunch with a neighbor on Tuesday. No one would have guessed that she was preparing for something much larger. Her attorney called midweek. "They're getting nervous," he said. "Good," Margaret replied. "They've requested a formal hearing to resolve the estate disputes." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. "This will be public," he added. She smiled. That was exactly what she had been waiting for. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. Evelyn prepared meticulously. She coached Richard on what to say. She reviewed her statements repeatedly. She even practiced her expressions in the mirror, concerned, reasonable, composed. She had controlled rooms like this before. Margaret arrived early. She sat quietly, hands folded, eyes forward. To anyone watching, she looked small, out of place, a relic from a simpler time. That illusion worked in her favor. When the proceedings began, Evelyn spoke first. Her voice was confident, measured. "This is a simple misunderstanding," she said. "My mother-in-law is grieving. She's confused by paperwork she doesn't fully understand." Margaret didn't react. The council members nodded. Evelyn continued. "We've always acted in the family's best interest." Margaret's attorney stood. "May I present evidence?" Evelyn's smile tightened. "Proceed," the chair said. The first document appeared on the screen, then the second, then the third. Each one contradicted Evelyn's narrative. The room shifted again. Margaret remained silent. That silence was deliberate, because the more Evelyn spoke, the more she revealed. "These documents are being taken out of context," Evelyn insisted. "They don't show intent." "No," the attorney replied calmly. "They show pattern." Richard swallowed hard. The council chair leaned forward. "Mrs. Hale," he said to Margaret, "why did you not raise these concerns earlier?" Margaret lifted her gaze. "Because no one asked," she said simply. The words landed like a verdict. For the first time, the room looked at her differently, not as a passive figure, but as a witness. Evelyn interrupted. "This is ridiculous. She's been silent for years." Margaret turned to her. "Yes," she said. "I was." She paused. "And that's why you felt safe." Evelyn's composure cracked. Margaret's attorney pressed forward. "We'd also like to submit additional records, bank communications, notarized statements, and correspondence from Mr. Hale's former financial advisor." Evelyn stood up. "No," she said. "This is harassment." The chair raised a hand. "Sit down." Evelyn hesitated, then complied. That moment, small as it was, marked the turning point. Margaret watched as the illusion collapsed piece by piece, not through confrontation, through exposure. When the hearing adjourned for recess, Evelyn rushed into the hallway, phone pressed to her ear. Richard remained behind, staring at his mother. "I didn't know," he whispered. Margaret met his gaze. "I know." The recess ended. The council reconvened, and for the first time Evelyn was no longer in control of the room. The woman she believed wouldn't fight back had never needed to. She had simply waited long enough for the truth to become unavoidable, and the name that would change everything was about to be spoken aloud. The room felt different when they returned from recess. It wasn't louder. It wasn't tense in the way people expected tension to look. It was heavier, like everyone had suddenly realized they were sitting inside a moment that would not rewind. Margaret took her seat without a word. She didn't straighten her posture or adjust her expression. She didn't need to perform. The performance had already failed, just not hers. Evelyn returned last. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble floor, each step a little faster than before. She avoided Margaret's eyes entirely, choosing instead to sit rigidly, arms crossed, jaw tight. The smile she had perfected over years of social maneuvering was gone. The council chair cleared his throat. "We will continue," he said. "Counsel, you mentioned additional evidence." Margaret's attorney stood. "Yes," he replied. "But before we proceed, there is one clarification that must be made." He turned slightly toward Margaret. "Mrs. Hale," he said, "with your permission." Margaret nodded once. The attorney faced the counsel again. Up to this point, Mrs. Hale has been treated as a passive beneficiary. That assumption is incorrect. Evelyn scoffed. Oh, please. The attorney didn't look at her. Mrs. Hale, he continued, is not simply a widow navigating grief. She is the original co-owner of Hale Holdings, established 46 years ago. The room stilled. Richard's head snapped up. Evelyn froze. The attorney placed a single document on the table. These are the original incorporation records, filed jointly, signed by both parties. Margaret remained silent. The council chair leaned forward. Are you stating that Mrs. Hale retained ownership authority? I am stating, the attorney replied, that she never relinquished it. A murmur rippled through the room. Evelyn stood abruptly. That's impossible. Thomas handled everything. Margaret finally spoke. He managed, she said calmly. I owned. The words landed without force, but they shattered something fundamental. Evelyn laughed, sharp and brittle. You expect us to believe you ran a company? Margaret turned to her slowly. I didn't run it, she said. I built it. Then I stepped back, because someone had to raise a family. Silence followed. Margaret's attorney continued. Mrs. Hale's silence over the years was not ignorance. It was strategic distance. Her ownership stake remained intact. Her voting power remained intact. And her oversight, through third-party fiduciaries, remained active. Evelyn's face drained of color. That's a lie, she whispered. The attorney pressed a button. A new document appeared on the screen, then another and another. Financial oversight reports, third-party audits, correspondence dated years back. Every one of them bore Margaret's authorization. Evelyn staggered back into her chair. Richard looked at his mother as if seeing her for the first time. You knew all this? He asked softly. Margaret nodded. I knew what mattered. The council chair adjusted his glasses. Mrs. Hale, he said, why did you allow others to act as though you had no authority? Margaret folded her hands. Because power doesn't always need to speak, she replied. Sometimes it only needs to listen. Evelyn snapped. This is manipulation. She let us believe. Yes, Margaret said gently. You believed what you wanted to believe. The room shifted again. Margaret's attorney spoke with precision now. We also submit these records showing unauthorized asset transfers executed under false assumptions of sole control. Evelyn shook her head violently. No. Those were approved. Approved by whom? The attorney asked. Evelyn opened her mouth. No answer came. The council chair's voice was firm. Mrs. Hale. Evelyn. We will need an explanation. Evelyn stood again, this time unsteady. I did what was best for the family. Margaret looked at her. You did what was best for yourself, she said. How you just forgot who was watching. That was the moment the narrative collapsed completely. The council conferred quietly. Papers moved. Names were whispered. Then the chair looked up. Effective immediately, he said. All contested transfers are frozen pending investigation. Mrs. Hale retains full authority over the estate and corporate interests. Evelyn gasped. Richard stared at the table. And, the chair continued, we are referring this matter for independent review regarding misrepresentation and breach of fiduciary duty. Evelyn's knees buckled. She sat hard. Margaret didn't move. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. The punishment wasn't emotional, it was procedural, and it was devastating. The hearing concluded shortly after. People filed out slowly, glancing at Margaret with something new in their eyes. Respect, fear, recognition. In the hallway, Richard approached her. I didn't know, he said again. I thought you were just tired, quiet. Margaret met his gaze. I was tired, she said, of being underestimated. Evelyn was escorted out separately. She didn't look back. 6 months later, the consequences were impossible to ignore. The investigation confirmed misconduct. Accounts were restructured. Public filings amended. Evelyn resigned from every board she had once dominated, quietly, without ceremony. Hale Holdings issued a formal statement naming Margaret Hale as primary authority. The media framed it as a shocking reversal. Those who knew better called it inevitable. Margaret declined interviews. She didn't need the spotlight. She had spent a lifetime proving that silence didn't mean absence, only patience. On a quiet afternoon, Margaret sat in her garden, sunlight warming her hands. A neighbor asked her once, How did you endure all those years?" Margaret smiled softly. "I wasn't enduring," she said. "I was preparing, because the truth had never been hidden. It had simply been ignored. And when it finally spoke, it didn't raise its voice. It ended everything quietly. They thought silence meant weakness, but silence was the plan." If this story made you rethink who truly holds the power, subscribe and stay with us, because the quiet ones are usually the ones who end everything.